Did you anticipate the level of opposition that you would get?
No, not at all. There were people at the back of the room who were armed. Somebody tried to have my wife arrested on an invented assault charge. There were death threats made against my family on Facebook. It was like 400 people in a room, and I had to MC the whole thing. It was lively.
I'm sure the vast majority of you have never been to a town meeting or a public hearing. The closest you've probably come is reading or watching a news report about a group of protesters demonstrating at a meeting against something, which wouldn't necessarily make you feel more inclined to want to go. That's one of the reasons we spoke in a previous episode about how impactful just the act of writing a letter to a town official can be. But that's a topic for another episode. Episode 4, in fact. Today we'll talk about how a town meeting helped lead Marguerite Wells, friend of the podcast, my boss, and executive director of the Alliance for Clean Energy New York, to her current role. I'm Barry Wygel. This is Plugging In. Welcome to Plugging In, powering our way to a brighter and healthier New York. I'm your host, Barry Wygel. Each episode on this podcast, we will discuss a different topic related to clean energy, explaining complex topics in a way you can understand. Become part of the community as we help to make a brighter and healthier New York.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow we breathe easier, tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in, the future of New York is here.
So Marguerite, welcome back to the podcast. You're officially our first three-peat guest.
Thank you, Barry. Glad to be here.
So on today's episode, we want to get to know a little bit more about you, your past work promoting renewable energy, a project that you were involved in. One thing that there is a misconception about clean energy is the level of opposition that's out there. Everyone knows someone who's against renewable energy. You see it in poll results, you see it at family dinner conversations, you see it when we tell people what we do for a living. But when you actually tell some of the stories of the levels of effort that the opposition puts in, it can be surprising. And we've done previous episodes talking about how important it is to be involved in the process, go to town board meetings, know what's happening. But even when we tell those stories, sometimes I'll hear from people saying, well, the opposition's not going to be there, right? Like who would care enough to go to these meetings? So that kind of sets us up for what we're going to talk about today.
It does.
My first question for you, how did you get involved in clean energy?
So I didn't start in energy at all. I used to be a full-time farmer. I'd always wanted to be a farmer. I made that happen. I was loving what I was doing for a living. And I met a neighbor who gave a presentation locally to where I live in the Finger Lakes in upstate New York, talking about how he had this idea we could have a wind farm in our town because there's a windy hill and there was a transmission line that crossed it. And I didn't know anything about the energy business at the time, but I thought it sounded like a great idea. So I introduced myself to him at the end of the meeting and gave him my phone number and said, hey, if you ever need a hand, let me know. And he called me a few weeks later, and he's one of these older fellows who just refuses to learn computers. And so he said, hey, do you know what a PDF is? Can you print one of those? I said, yeah, I can print a PDF. He said, great, I'm going to forward you this email because I can do that much. And I'm going to come to your house and get the printout and see what it says. So that's how I became a wind developer, because I can print a PDF.
When you first heard about the project, got involved, did you anticipate the level of opposition that you would get?
No, not at all. And for many years, we didn't have opposition. It was really well supported locally.
Okay, so then let's get into what this project actually was. How does one propose a renewable energy project?
Well, we did it a little bit unconventionally. There are a handful of examples across the U.S. of communities who have decided to build their own wind farm and have succeeded. And so we followed some of their models at the beginning because we were not a company. We were just some individual people who lived in the town and liked this idea. And so that neighbor I mentioned put up a meteorological tower to test the wind, and we started just figuring out what you needed to do. He was paying for certain studies and initial work out of his own pocket, and I was doing the sweat equity work of sending emails and doing calls and that kind of thing. And as I got more involved, I got more excited about it. So years went by. And my neighbor ran out of money, so I took the project over. I really wanted to see it happen at that point, and so I formed my own company, put together a board of directors, and went out and raised about $3 million in investment from local families. It was 150 local investors who participated, and all of that money was to do the development work just to bring the project forward. So that was engineering, environmental studies, that kind of thing. So it went for about 7 or 8 years without any opposition at all. And tons of support and approvals from the town board and lots of excitement from local people who wanted to be the owners of this long-term facility. And it was only at the very 11th hour that somebody showed up who bought a house sight unseen in the town. It was her 4th home. She didn't even live there. But she heard about the wind farm after she'd closed on this weekend house and decided to throw her substantial financial resources at trying to kill the project. And she succeeded. She basically threatened lawsuits all around and hired, there's a cadre of consultants whose job it is to oppose wind farms. They have a certain shtick and you can hire them and that's what they do. And so she hired them and they terrified the town board into inaction. And eventually my little project ran out of money because it didn't have any corporate backing. We had spent all our money on all the studies that are required to bring a project forward. We didn't have a war chest to spend on PR or on lawyers or litigation. So that's what killed that project after 9 years.
And like you said, this wasn't really the normal way to build a renewable energy project. The projects we've talked about on this podcast are ones where the developer identifies the site and then works with the municipality. Are people doing what you did or are trying to do? Is that still happening?
It's very rare. I mean, it was rare 10, 15 years ago when I started this. It's at least as rare now. There are many people who have the idea that local people should have a part ownership stake in the projects in their neighborhoods. And I think it's a great concept. It's really hard to execute on, having lived through 9 years of trying to make it work, working with bank financing and all the complexities of how a project gets put together. Because even a small project like that one at 16 megawatts, it was just 7 wind turbines, would have been a $50 million proposition. And that can't come out of the pockets of just a few local people. That's just too many dollars. But that said, I think there is still room for creativity on local equity components. It can't be that, the whole town just owns 7 wind turbines. That was one of the proposals we initially explored, but the risk is greater than is fair to put on a township. Operating these things properly and making them run and having them run in the black, not in the red, is really hard, and you really need a professional outfit to help have that be successful.
So when did you first realize that there was going to be a problem? It seems like it was smooth sailing up until then. A lot of work obviously went into it and a lot of time, more than I would have thought. You said almost 9 years to get to that point. So when did you first start to think like this could be a problem?
When that person started threatening lawsuits. They were new to town. They were not known to me or anybody else locally, but they did a grassroots effort to try to terrify the neighborhood and succeeded at that. It was amazing how people that were supportive of the project for years, I'd stop by their house because I'd see an oppositional sign out in the yard. I remember this one time. It's like, Larry, what happened? You've been supportive of this project for years. And he said, oh, don't even talk to me about it. My wife painted that sign. She put it up. I'd be up for a divorce if I asked her to take it down. So just leave the sign right there. Sorry, honey. And that was that. People who used to pick up the phone for me all the time wouldn't even answer my knock at the door anymore.
And with legitimate concerns, were they just becoming informed? Or what do you think made them change their mind or take this other stance?
I think fear is contagious. And I think they believed the fear-mongering that was being spread around. And so even the years of stakeholder work I had done and all the benefits that were going to come to the town, they just got spooked.
When you talk about those benefits, I'm assuming they're similar to what we talk about with other renewable energy projects. There would have been.
Oh, for sure. Right. I mean, I had a pilot agreement with the county. It would have been tons of tax dollars for the town. The town is not a wealthy town, so it doesn't even really have a very good town hall, and we were going to maybe invest in a town hall with some of those funds. All of that went by the wayside.
Were there moments where this came to a head? I feel like you've told me some stories, but
there was a very dramatic public hearing that was held in the gym of the local elementary school, where this really did come to a head. After years of very boring town process, this was sort of the referendum. There were people at the back of the room who were armed. Somebody tried to have my wife arrested on an invented assault charge. There were death threats made against my family on Facebook. There was it was like 400 people in a room. And I had to MC the whole thing. It was lively. But it also helped me understand later, when I've seen that same dynamic set up in other communities, that it was not unique to my community. And I had thought that community ownership and the fact that we had 150 local families who were the investors in this thing was somehow going to inoculate the project against opposition, and it didn't at all.
Had you seen opposition elsewhere? Were you ready
Sure.
or bracing for opposition?
Yeah, I'd seen opposition on other projects, and I had mistakenly thought that part of the gut reaction of people against a project in their town was a sort of anti-corporate instinct, and that maybe by being locally owned, I was immune to that, and I was not.
Do you think these people were always, well, you mentioned some that weren't, but some people were always against the project and just unwilling to speak up, and they finally got what they needed to speak up, or was it really tide turn, public opinion turn?
It was a tide turn in this particular case. It really was. People who had been supportive were no longer, because they were convinced by these consultants who make it their job to be convincing and go around selling this to town boards on, for hire. And I think people just sort of, if you go on the internet and believe what you read, wind turbines can kill you all kinds of ways. The fact that they actually don't, and reality and facts don't bear that out, doesn't seem to matter to internet readers at 2 a.m.
Yeah. And were these consultants, these were funded by this one person?
Yeah, this one person, she was a wealthy attorney, and so she had way more money than we did. So yeah, she funded it out of her own pocket.
So it came down to, this was definitely not judged based on its merits. This project did not pass or fail because of its merits.
No, in fact, it had passed all its environmental reviews and, had been reviewed by engineers and lawyers and all that kind of thing representing the town. On its environmental merits, it was very plain vanilla. It was the only thing I needed, the only reason they had any leverage to block the project at all was that in the environmental review under SEQR, State Environmental Quality Review Act, you have a whole bunch of draft things. So in this case, there was a draft fire and emergency plan. The last step I needed before we could put shovels in the ground was for that draft plan to be deemed final. We'd gone to the fire department, we had their buy-in on what it said. All it was, a town board, very ministerial thing to say, okay, this draft plan is now deemed the final plan. That's all we needed. And that was the approval that they could step into the breach and say, no, you can't approve that. We're going to threaten to sue all you.
And you mentioned at the beginning that the reason it eventually really died was down to money. You couldn't fight these lawsuits, but what did you think after that contentious meeting? Were you scared off then?
No, I wasn't scared off. I was disheartened that it had come to that I had not done a better job doing stakeholder outreach all along. I thought I had, but I could have done better, obviously. And so if I had to do it over again, there are certainly things I would do better and do differently in order to try to prevent that kind of takeover at the last minute from somebody who didn't even live in the town.
And I guess as your career progressed beyond this, you do get to do that in a way. You advise, you got to build projects from your previous, and now you're advising and talking to those people that are in the trenches doing stakeholder engagement, building on this. So what are some of those things you would have done different?
I would have done a lot more stakeholder outreach. I thought I had done enough because I'd met with everybody, but I didn't keep it up. I didn't keep the narrative going all day, every day, the way I needed to. So when I had it to do over again after this project died and I worked on another project in the North Country, I doubled down on stakeholder outreach. I really did, because I saw the degree to which it can really make a difference in a project's success or failure.
Was that project successful?
Sure was. It's spinning now. Number 3 wind farm in Lewis County.
It's amazing that you weren't defeated or deterred. Those are scary things to have gone through. You were just trying to do something good for your community. I mean, what did your wife think about this? Gave us both kind of PTSD for a while on the whole subject. We couldn't even go near that whole section of town for a few years because it just brought back such unpleasant memories. But it didn't deter me from the goal, because I think the goal is really worthy. We need the renewable energy and we need the economic development in upstate New York. And just because somebody's wealthy and oppositional doesn't give them the right to make that choice for everybody. Does that person live in that house now?
It's a weekend house still.
What was their big bugaboo?
They just don't like wind turbines.
Didn't want to look at it?
Don't want to look at them.
Okay. Interesting.
And when you're that wealthy, you can throw your money around.
But obviously you weren't deterred about clean energy because you then went on to, so that obviously informed and got you ready for your next
Very much
career move.
informed my next career move. Yes. So I decided to go the opposite. Rather than going the small, locally funded, under the radar route, I went to work for a big developer working on some of the biggest projects that have been proposed in New York. Because one of the things that I saw was how challenging the community ownership component made a lot of other things about project development. And I decided that for me, anyway, building the projects was more important than the community ownership aspect of them. And I didn't want to risk future project success by folding that in too much. I had thought that I had actually started my next business to do community-owned wind farms around New York because I had been invited by other communities who had been watching Black Oak to say, hey, I'd love to have a little wind farm in our town too, and I'd love it to be community owned. And so I had a whole roster of sites across the state that were inviting me in to do that in their town. And when that first project failed, I realized the many points of failure. I mean, it's very easy to point blame on that one opponent and her money, but there were actually a number of other ingredients to the project that made it really hard to succeed. And so I didn't want to repeat any of those problems either. I wanted to make sure that I was working towards getting projects that will actually get built.
And you did.
And I did.
And that led you here
and
eventually.
That led me here to ACE New York. And part of the reason I am so excited about this work is the opportunity to bring my experiences on other projects to help more projects get built here in the state of New York, because it's a really challenging environment to succeed in. Many states with lighter regulation and fewer residents have more projects built, but I think that's my value add here.
Two final questions. The first being, people that hear about that contentious meeting, and these meetings, that wasn't a one-off in New York. No. Contentious meetings happen when it comes to renewable energy. It's fair that people might be scared to go to those meetings as supporters, but, give a little encouragement, little reassurance to people that it's okay to be a supporter of these projects. It
is okay. And I think the more supporters come, the more they support one another in their ability to speak up. I think it's pretty easy to get intimidated if somebody is, being unpleasant and saying a negative opinion. But that's why supporters are so important in that circumstance, so that they do speak up, so that whoever the audience is for this performance art of public hearing can see that there are two sides. Because one of the things I learned after my Black Oak project died, I had thought that opposition was maybe specific to renewable energy, but I could see in attending town boards all over that people oppose all kinds of things. And they come out very angry for all kinds of things, even as mundane as sidewalks and planting trees or cutting down trees, things like that are really not so contentious, I would think. So in all of those circumstances, I've seen the importance of having supportive people there so that the town board or whoever the body is can understand that there are both sides represented.
And knowing that your role as a supporter at these meetings is not to convince the angry people there, it's to show, like you said, that there's two sides, and to talk to the town board or whoever is hosting these meetings. So it's not your job to get up in their face and be in charge of changing their mind.
Yes, and I think for a lot of folks who are strongly entrenched in any position, it's very hard to change that. Not just change the thinking behind it, but the emotional connectedness to the other people who are in that group, who have become your social group, and are all in one place together. So that is a very hard thing to change. What is easier to change is anybody who's evaluating facts.
Final question. Are you still good with PDFs?
Yeah, funny thing. I can still open and I can still print a PDF.
Excellent. All right. And you know how to edit them too. I know that. So
that's happened too.
Perfect. All right, Marguerite, thank you so much for sharing your story today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Plugging In. I hope you learned something, and I hope you share this knowledge with someone else. It would be incredibly helpful if you leave us a 5-star review wherever you found this podcast. If there's a topic you would like us to cover in the future, or have a question about clean energy, send us an email at podcast@aceny.org. You can follow us on social media using the links in the show notes, or consider joining our Clean Energy Supporters mailing list at aceny.org/support. Your support is crucial to creating a brighter and healthier New York. I'll see you next time.
As the sun crests on the horizon, a new day dawns in our state. A new hope for tomorrow is rising, a clean future we create. Tomorrow Tomorrow we breathe easier. Tomorrow the skies are clear. Today we are plugging in